right, there's an idea that we spoke about yesterday, and I'd like to expand it because I think it has very important applications. Yesterday we talked about keeping your philosophical balance. Let's suppose you have an argument, and it's an argument which comes to a conclusion. There's a certain attitude, especially by the person who's putting the argument forward, either find something wrong with the argument or accept the conclusion. Because what's your alternative? The alternative is look the argument in the face and say, golly, it looks good to me, but I don't believe the conclusion. That sounds totally irrational. Sounds like you're beyond reason. Sounds like you're beyond logic. There's an argument that's supposed to demonstrate a conclusion, and you don't see anything wrong with the argument, so then you have to accept the conclusion. And I said yesterday, that's a mistake. And I'm not fighting with anybody. Anybody who's trained in logic and philosophy knows it's a mistake. It's a mistake because even if you don't see anything wrong with the argument, that doesn't mean there's nothing wrong with the argument. There might be something wrong with the argument, and you just don't see it. First thing you might do is do a Google search on the argument and see what other people have to say about the argument. Very often you'll find that the person who's saying it to you is either ignorant or just pulling the wool over your eyes and not letting you know that there's a problem with the argument. Unless suppose you do a Google search and nobody has any way to avoid the logic of the argument. Then are you stuck? No, because it might be that there's something wrong with the argument even though nobody knows what's wrong with the argument. I gave the example of Zeno, who had arguments to show that nothing moves, and no one could figure out what was wrong with those arguments for 2,300 years, and nobody drew the conclusion that nothing moves. Because here are arguments that show nothing moves, and we can't figure out what's wrong with the argument, so then we have to accept the conclusion. No one said that. What they said was, there's clearly something wrong with the argument, and we don't know what it is. And as I say, this is not controversial. Sometimes I do say things that are controversial, and I explain that and explain why I take the position that I do, but this is not controversial. Now, let me expand this, and then we should talk about when you can apply this and when you can't. One philosopher from whom I took what I'm going to tell you now is Gilbert Harmon, who's been at Princeton forever. Very fine, outstanding philosopher. But I don't think anybody disagrees. Just he wrote a book on change of view, which he describes this in detail. He distinguishes between logic and reasoning. Logic is a study of what implies what proves what kinds of arguments are really valid proofs, and what kinds of arguments aren't really valid proofs. And that sets up relationships between propositions. A implies B, then if A is true, B must be true. Reasoning is what flesh and blood people do in the battle of life with all their hopes and doubts and fears and uncertainties and worries to try to improve their intellectual position. Reasoning is a human activity. Logic is an abstract study. And there's a gigantic gap between the two, because even if logic determines a relationship between propositions, that doesn't tell you in your concrete struggle with the world what to do. So, for example, suppose logic establishes that A implies B. All right, what should I do about that? Well, if I'm really very solidly convinced that A is true, usually my response to learning that A implies B will be to take on B as something which I'm committed to. If, on the other hand, I'm really convinced that B has got to be wrong, then when I'm informed that A implies B, I will conclude that A is also wrong. And suppose I'm very convinced that A is right, and very convinced that B is wrong, and logic informs that A implies B, there's always the option of saying that in this case, logic made a mistake. Logic does make mistakes, or at least logicians make mistakes. The people who study and analyze and teach logic do make mistakes. There are famous mistakes that were made in logical systems. And if we're very convinced that A is true and very convinced that B is false, and logicians tell us that A implies B, one option is to say, well, then maybe the logicians make a mistake. They have made mistakes in the past. The fact that logic gives a deliverance doesn't automatically tell me what to do. I'm living my life in the midst of confusion, and I'm trying to put myself in a better position. In particular, a better position vis-a-vis truth and falsity. I like to believe more things that are true, and I'd like to believe less things that are false. That's how I would improve my position. But when logic gives me a relationship between propositions, that doesn't tell me what to do. Here's an extreme example. Is it ever right to commit yourself in such a way that you know you'll be believing something false? Is it ever right to commit yourself in such a way that you know you'll be believing something false? Now, of course, the natural thought is no. I mean, the whole point of being logical and reasoning is to avoid things that are false. Well, about 40 years ago, I forget who did this, one of the philosophers thought up something called the preface paradox. And the preface paradox works like this. An author writes a book. This book is 1,000 pages long, and on each page there are 3 important assertions. And in the preface, the author writes, I want you to know, you the reader, that I researched these ideas very, very carefully. It took me years and years to write this book. And every assertion that you find at every page, I spent a long time researching and discussing and debating and traveling the world. I have extremely high confidence in every one of the assertions in my book, all 3,000. Very high confidence. But, the author goes on to say in the preface, but there are 3,000 of them. 3,000. Probably among the 3,000, there are a few mistakes. Maybe 5 out of 3,000. Because of the odds, 3,000. In fact, the author may say, given the odds, I'm quite convinced that there are a few mistakes there. But in spite of it, the vast, vast majority have to be true. That's his preface. Okay, now let's consider the following 3,001 propositions. There are the 3,000 in the body of the book, and then there's the one proposition in the preface which says that somewhere in the book there's a mistake. Those 3,001 cannot all be right. Because if all 3,000 are true, then the statement in the preface is false. They cannot all be right. What should I do? Here's a batch, 3,001. What should I do with respect to that batch? Should I just reject all of them? That's not smart, because I'm going to lose a gigantic amount of really good information, really correct information. The right thing to do is to accept all 3,001, knowing that there'll be a few mistakes there, but gaining the gigantic benefit of 2,997 truths, which I can use. That means it is rational, reasonable, to adopt a policy whereby you know that you'll be believing something that's false. In this case, where it's a batch. And by the way, if this sounds very abstract and very fanciful, you're talking about every encyclopedia. Encyclopedia Britannica, when it used to be in volumes, was 20 volumes long. Thousands and thousands of pages. Of course there were mistakes there. Should someone refuse to look into the Encyclopedia Britannica? That would be dumb. Encyclopedia Britannica has a gigantic amount of correct and useful information. Okay, from time to time, you'll take a loss. But considering your alternatives for doing well in the world, you're much better off accepting them all than not accepting all of them. So there are cases in which reasoning will tell you, adopt this policy, even though you know that by adopting this policy, you're definitely going to accept some false beliefs, because any other policy is worse. Now, I could support your initial intuition that there's got to be a mistake here by creating the following question. What would happen if you have to make a decision and the correctness of the decision depends upon all 3,001 being true? what we would call the conjunction of all 3001. There you should say no, because you know for sure that the sum total of all 3001 isn't true. But I was talking about one-by-one decisions. Take each one of the 3001 and ask, given what it says, what should I do? There, it's clearly correct to take each one and to act on its basis, because you have no better alternative. So this is a good illustration of the difference between logic and reasoning. Reasoning is what I should do, what I should accept, what I should commit myself to, what it's reasonable for me to accept, given my background, my resources, and all the rest. Are we together so far? Okay, now, one element of reasoning is this. Imagine a person who says, I don't just take things on the surface, on face value. I don't accept something unless I have a proof. I'm a careful person, a cautious person, a reasonable, very rational person. I want proofs. Without a proof, I'm not going to accept it. Can you imagine some problem with that policy? Well, let's see. What is a proof? I'm considering whether or not to accept Q. Somebody says, look, A, B, and C imply Q. Given A, B, and C, you can prove Q. Wonderful. Now I'm going to accept Q. What question ought I to ask?
A, B, and C.
Why am I accepting A, B, and C? Oh, I'm very careful. I'm very conservative. I don't just accept things. No, I want a proof. Okay. Consider PQ, and R. PQ and R establish A, B, and C. Home free. Except, what about PQ and R? Now, how's this going to play out?
It's just going to keep going.
Well, tell you a secret. Under my cranium, there's a finite number of neurons. It can't go on forever. I can't go on forever. So how's this going to play out? Don't I have to come to a stop somewhere? And then I'm going to be accepting some things without a proof. That does seem like it's the human condition. Doesn't seem that you can avoid that. You haven't got room in there for an infinity of proofs. That's one point. Now another point. What is a proof? I'm considering Q, and somebody says, look, A, B, and C imply Q. Why should I pay attention to that? Back to Gilbert Harmon. So A, B, and C imply Q. So what? Maybe, if I don't like Q, I should just reject A, B, and C. Why should I accept Q? It's got to be that I'm more confident, clear, I'm more settled on A, B, and C than I am of Q. So I say, Q, gee, I don't know. Somebody points out, how do you feel about A, B, and C? I'm pretty confident that A, B, and C are right. They seem to be really pretty strong. Well, watch, this person says. A, B, and C imply Q. I say, wow, that's very important information. So the strength of my conviction in A, B, and C now will transfer to Q. That's a good reason to accept Q, only because my commitment to A, B, and C was superior. A proof like that helps me make progress, helps me decide what to accept or what not to accept, only if the premises in the proof are better established than the thing that's being proved. Now, how far can that go? Can it always be more solid, better established, more conviction? Or is there a limit to that? What happens if you get to something that's just obvious? It's obvious. What could be more obvious, more solid, and more established than 2 + 2 is 4? Anything in your whole worldview, in your whole life, that's more solid than 2 + 2 is 4? Can you imagine an alternative to 2 + 2 is 4? You have any doubts about 2 + 2 is 4? One of the funny things about number theory is they prove 2 + 2 is 4. The naive and correct reaction is, prove it? Why? Why would you want to prove it? What could you possibly know that you know better than 2 + 2 is 4? What do you want to prove it for? And the answer is for organization and insight and global considerations. It's not going to make me any more certain or committed to 2 + 2 is 4 because other things imply it. There's nothing more solid than that. So even if I had infinite capacity, and can go on an infinite chase of infinity of proofs, there might not be any reason to do so, because once you come back to something with maximum solidity, there's no question of proving them, because there's nothing more solid than they from which they could possibly follow, because there's nothing more solid than they in your whole repertoire. Proving for a person in reasoning means achieving more solidity by linking things together. I can achieve more solidity for Q by linking it to A, B, and C if A, B, and C are more solid. And if they're really more solid, then I've achieved something. Because now Q inherits that solidity and becomes more solid for me. And that's a step forward. But when you get to the things that are maximally solid, there's nothing left to do. So, I have a second reason for saying there are some things that you're going to accept without proof. You're going to accept it because if someone demands a proof, you'll say, but look, these can't be proved because there's nothing more solid than they to prove them with. So they're just the top of the chain. This reasoning has the following implication. Take a proposition about which everyone in the world thinks that it's obviously true. Now, listen to what I'm saying carefully, because I'm going to qualify it in a minute if you generalize too far. I take a proposition for which for everyone in the world is obviously true, then it is perfectly appropriate to accept it, to believe it, to be committed to it, without any further investigation. You have reason enough to accept it. That doesn't mean it's necessarily right. It just means you have reason enough to accept it. Not only that, but if somebody says, look, it's your opinion, but I have a different opinion, that person convicts himself of utter irrationality, even if it might not be true, because all of the evidence, all of the reason that we're capable of supports it. It still might not be true, but it's not open for simple disagreement. You have your view, I have my view. Anyone who tries to make that move, I have a different view, convicts himself of utter irrationality. Suppose someone did with 2 + 2 is 4. That's your view. That's your hypothesis. These words are grotesque, aren't they? It's a view, an hypothesis, that 2 + 2 is 4. But my feeling is that 2 + 2 is 5. That person has put himself outside the realm of rational discourse. 2 + 2 is 5 is not an option of simple preference. I'll give you another example. Concrete example. There's a table in this room, right? 2 maybe, but there's at least 1 table in this room. Now suppose somebody said, I know that's your view, that's your hypothesis, there's a table, but I feel differently about it. I feel there aren't any tables in this room. What would you do? I don't think you'd do anything except stop talking to him. He's sitting in this room with us, and he says it's his view that there aren't tables in the room. Either he's not serious or he needs help. It's just too obvious that there's a table in this room to disagree about it.
An idea.
What's an idea?
That if he says there's no table, then he'd have to have reasoning behind it.
Okay, then it could mean that either the simple idea is that he doesn't mean by table what we mean by table. That's the next move that you make when you're talking to people. Tell me what you mean. Because often we don't understand one another. And often a person uses words in a way that I'm not familiar with. And I have to ask him for an explanation of what he means. Principle of charity would say he probably is a reasonable person. He's probably means something that's at least reasonable. Ask him what he means. If he says he means the same thing, then he might have a whole story to tell. That's why I said what's not an option is to simply disagree and treat what we're saying as a hypothesis. He might have a story to tell. I'll give you an example in this case, then I'll give you a real example and show you what it means to tell a story. Suppose he says, look, I know it's obvious to you that there are tables. I know it's obvious to everybody in the world that there are tables. But let me tell you something. I was hiking in the Andes Mountains, and I came across a crashed spaceship. And I saw that because they crashed into the Earth, they had learned the Earth's languages, and they were communicating in Earth's languages. And I saw a plan that they had to take over world communications and to hypnotize everyone in the world to believe in tables. And I saw the record of when they did that. They gave everyone in the world a post-hypnotic suggestion to believe in tables. So that's why you believe in tables. I know why you believe in tables. But it isn't true because I can explain why you believe what you believe. I can also explain why it's wrong. Now that's a story. That's a story. That might be worthy of investigation. Send some people to the Andes and check the thing out. But that's not just, you believe there are tables, I believe differently. That does convict the person of irrationality. But he thinks he has a whole story whereby he can explain why everybody believes what they believe. He can explain why they all think it's obvious. And he can explain why they're wrong. Then you'd have to take it seriously. That's why I said, when something is obvious to everybody, it's appropriate to believe it. It's fully irrational to believe it without further background. But that doesn't mean it's necessarily true. Now let's take a real example. Is the Earth stationary? That, I think, although there was considerable, actually in the ancient world there were theories that it wasn't stationary either. But to many people, that was just obviously correct. I mean, can't you see that it's stationary? I mean, what kind of drugs are you using if you don't think it's stationary? You experience it, it's stationary. And furthermore, its being stationary has obvious effects that you can check. Climb a tower, take a rock, drop it parallel to the wall of the tower. Now, if the tower is moving, then in the time that the rock falls to the ground, the tower ought to move. And either it's moving towards the stone, in which case the stone ought to hit the wall, or it's moving away, in which case it ought to land on the ground further away from the tower than it was when you dropped it. But that doesn't happen, boys and girls. It falls and lands exactly the same distance away from the tower that it was when you dropped it. So obviously, the Earth is not moving. That's the kind of thing that people said. And furthermore, you don't feel the wind whistling through your hair, do you? So it's obviously not moving. Now, somebody said in the face of that, I know what you think. You think it's not moving? I think it is moving. That would convict him of irrationality. Against all of our common experience, and against at least this case of a proposed experiment, and he just says, I think differently, that's just blank irrational. But suppose he says, listen, if the Earth's moving and you're on it, then you're moving with it, aren't you? So I say, oh, how about that? I guess I am. Now, you climb to the top of that tower, you put your hand out, you're going to drop the stone. Remember, I say, the tower is moving, you're moving, your hand is moving, the stone in your hand is moving, together with the Earth. Okay? So now when you drop it, what's going to happen? Well, it's going to fall down with the motion of the curve. So of course it's going to land just as far from the base as it was when you held your hand out. Not because the Earth isn't moving, but because the stone is moving with it. Oh, I say, golly, maybe my experiment doesn't clinch it. And what about the wind whistling through my hair? The wind is also moving together with the Earth. And therefore you won't feel it whistling through your hair. Oh. Now, at this point, I think we don't even have a standoff. So the critic says, so I say it's moving. I think he's still wrong. Because although you could work it out that it's moving and everything would seem the same, there's no reason to think it's moving. It seems to be stationary. And you've worked it out that if it were moving, but there's no reason to say it's moving. So the correct default position is that it's stationary. How did we become convinced that it's moving? Anybody know? Experiments with pendulums. You set a pendulum moving. Imagine you have a pendulum at the North Pole. You have a big apparatus, a long wire, you have a heavy ball at the bottom, and you set it swinging. What are you going to observe? Well, remember, you're standing at the North Pole, and truthfully, the Earth is turning around, right? What you're going to see is this. The ball is going to swing like this, and then it's going to swing like this, and then it's going to swing like this, and then it's going to swing like this. The plane of the pendulum's swing is going to rotate. And guess what? It's going to go around once every 24 hours. Why is that? Are there little leprechauns pushing it around, shoving it from the side? A whole bunch of flies on one side, beating their wings? Obviously not. Now that could be explained by the Earth rotating. All of a sudden you have positive evidence in favor of the Earth rotating and not being stationary. That's important. At that point, it would be appropriate to change your mind. But a person who simply says, I know you think it's stationary, I think it's moving, that person convicts himself of irrationality. So it is perfectly appropriate to accept something that everybody thinks is obvious, unless and until you have such a story that explains why everybody thinks it's obvious, explains it in such a way where it might not be correct, and then gives positive evidence that it is not correct. Under those conditions, you can give it up. Absent that, it's perfectly appropriate to accept it. So when you trace back any reasoning to something like that, mere opposite opinion isn't going to help. And as I said yesterday, an argument which is less certain than what you believe isn't going to help either. I told you about G.E. Moore yesterday, right? How he refutes idealism. Right? This is a hand, and this is a hand. So they're physical objects. And when the students complain, but Professor Moore, an idealist won't accept that they're physical objects. Moore said, he was a professor at Cambridge after all, he said, I know that, but ask yourself, what do you know better? That you have hands or the philosophical arguments that the idealists give? The philosophical arguments the idealists give are philosophical arguments, after all. That's all they are. And people who know the history of philosophy know that every 100 years they change anyway. Surely you are far more certain that you have hands than you are that the idealist arguments are correct. So in a conflict between the two, the right thing to say is, of course I have hands, and the arguments have to be wrong, and it's a matter for further research to figure out what's wrong. Just like with Zeno, just like with 2 = 1 that I showed you yesterday. You don't have to be pushed into a corner on the grounds that somebody has an argument. Now this, I think, is very useful. People get frightened by seeing an argument, not knowing how to respond, and then they feel they're responsible to give up what they believe if they can't refute the argument. If the item that you are considering is solid enough on its own, you're not responsible to do that. Let's take, for example, absolute morality. The relativist says the following, which is a total cheat. It's a total cheat. And I can tell you why it's a total cheat. But what he says is this: you believe in absolute morality, prove it. Prove that morality is absolute. Prove that it's universal. Prove that it's binding. Prove that it's true. Well, that's not easy. That's not easy. So he says, well, you can't prove it. Give it up. Give it up. Give it up means become a relativist. There are 2 mistakes here. 2 drastic philosophical mistakes. One mistake is, but it's obvious to everyone that morality is absolute. There's no one who doubts that the Nazis were really evil. There's no one who doubts that rape is really evil. If you're dealing with a feminist who can't think straight, so talk to her about rape. That's where she'll draw the line. That rape is definitely evil. That's just a matter of your culture or a matter of your training and your habituation or your ethnic values and everything else. That's where they'll draw the line, rightfully so. That rape is wrong whenever and wherever it's practiced. So now what do you have? You have a philosophical argument you can't answer versus the universal conviction of mankind that some things are really wrong. Philosophical argument can't dislodge that. It's not strong enough to dislodge that. The right response is, very interesting argument. If I can find some out-of-work philosophers, I'll set them at work figuring out what's wrong with the argument. I don't have to give up my universal conviction that this is correct because of a philosophical argument. Philosophical argument is not strong enough to do that. Furthermore, in this case of absolute morality, let's suppose the believer in absolute morality can't produce a proof that he's right. He shouldn't be pushed to become a relativist. That's wrong. What he should say is, okay, I don't know if absolutism is right, but I don't know that relativism is right either. If anything, if you could push him to do anything, I just argue you shouldn't push him at all. But if you push him at anything, what he ought to say is, I don't know whether or not absolutism is right. And you, relativist, don't know either, unless you have a positive argument in favor of relativism, which I would be very interested in hearing, and I can tell you they haven't got anything to say. Then the right position is ignorance. Not going over to his side and become a relativist. Simply It's an open area in philosophy. It's a difficult area. And because it's a difficult area, we can't claim to know either side. He doesn't win by default. Relativism doesn't win by default. Relativism is it's a real position. Real position, real content. At any rate, this is the general way in which we operate in the world. And without operating this way in the world, you can't do any reasoning. Let's think about logic. When you use logic, you're trusting certain rules, certain deductions, certain types of argument. Right? Why are you trusting them? Just because they're as solid as anything can be. There's nothing more solid than them, so I've got no leverage with which to escape them. Let me give you a piece of reasoning. Probably most of you, maybe all of you, are not familiar with this, and show you how it works, and then show you what it does to you when the reasoning takes hold. Consider all men are mortal. Does it follow that all things that are not mortal are not men?
Yeah.
Consider if George went to the store, he bought milk. Does it follow that if he didn't buy milk, he didn't go to the store? They're exactly the same. He said yes to the first one, no to the second one. People who have not, it's called the contrapositive. People who have not heard this before find this disorienting and often can't hear any relationship between the premise and the conclusion, why one thing has to do with the other. But it is a piece of absolute logic. Piece of absolute logic. Let me try to show you why. Let's take the second one. I accept if George went to the store, then he bought milk. If he went to the store, then he bought milk. Okay. Now suppose in addition, someone tells me, by the way, I happen to know that he didn't buy milk. What can you conclude from that? Well, it must be that he didn't go to the store, because if he had gone to the store, then he would have bought milk, because that was the first premise. Right? If he went to the store, he bought milk. So if he didn't buy milk, it must be that he didn't go to the store. And the second one does follow from the first one. Right? From, if he went to the store, he bought milk, it follows that if he didn't buy milk, he didn't go to the store. Take all men are mortal. If you think of classes, that means you've got the class of things that are mortal, which include wolves and butterflies and mosquitoes and things like that. And say all men are mortal, that means the class of men is a subclass among the mortals. And all the men are inside the class of mortals. Mm-hmm. Okay? Now consider something that's not mortal. Something that's not mortal is outside the big circle. It's out there. So obviously it's outside the circle of men. It's got to be. So if all men are mortal, obviously all non-mortals are non-men. Now, at least some of you, maybe all of you, didn't appreciate that before I started talking 5 minutes ago. Now you appreciate it, or you'll think it over and you'll mull it through in your minds and you'll come to appreciate it. Here's reasoning that has produced a new piece of information for you. As I say, the rule is called the contrapositive. You can look it up on the web. Is that up for grabs? Is that something which, you might discover tomorrow somebody else feels differently about? That's simple, direct reasoning.
So it's saying that all reasoning may be theories.
No, what I'm saying is not all reasoning is equal. Not all reasoning is equal. Some is very fundamental, very simple, very precise, very exact, and therefore very convincing. And other is much more theoretical, much more vague, and carries less conviction. Mathematics is famous that the proofs of mathematics stick. The ancient Greeks proved things in mathematics, and we still accept their proofs today. We still use their proofs today. Right? Mathematics has that kind of stability. It just doesn't seem to be any way to think your way around or out of that stuff. Okay, I'll say for the recording, I taught philosophy of mathematics. There are intuitionists, and there are finitists, and there are constructivists, and so forth and so on. They have philosophical objections, and they organize mathematics in different ways. They are 2% of working mathematicians, and they have their philosophical issues, but mathematics is stable in this way and is seems to be rock solid. And therefore, there's no room for someone to say, I have a different opinion. You have to have a whole story to tell, like the crash in the Andes Mountains, but just to have a different opinion, something like that, is not appropriate. And that's why we can use reasoning the way we do. If we couldn't do that, we could never move from one proposition to another. How did you move? Well, I use the contrapositive. Who's that? What's that? Why do you accept that? All reasoning is based on moves like this, which are moves that are accepted because they're, in terms of our understanding, are absolutely solid. Now, I want to answer an objection which people have made to this. And that is, look, if I'm going to do my reasoning inside my circle of things that are, for me, absolutely solid, am I not sort of trapping myself where I can't learn anything really new? I can't really come to break out of that circle? You said, they'll say to me, you said, Gottlieb, that not everything that's absolutely solid for you is true. How will you ever learn that it's not true if you're going to start all your reasoning with the things for you that are absolutely true? That means you're going to be stuck with them. You'll never be able to revise them. But that's not correct. It's not correct because among the things that are absolutely solid for me is that there are certain sources of information that should be trusted. Even sources of new information. If I walk outside and find that one of the trees on the walk here, and I know them pretty well because I've been walking up and down this walk for decades, is missing, I trust my eyes. I trust my eyes. I'm not going to say this it's absolutely certain for me that the tree is there. It always has been there, always will be there. If I don't see it, I'll go get my eyes checked. I'm not going to do that. What I'm going to say is, somebody moved the tree. I wonder why. Because one of my commitments is that what I see is correct. That's also a rock-solid commitment, which can have exceptions, but it's a rock-solid commitment. So that way I can learn new things, which will challenge old things that were solid and can lead me to revise the old things that used to be solid. That's like someone telling a story about the Andes Mountains and then coming to revise. I can go there and see the thing myself. I can get reports about what was in that spaceship. I can see the translations and everything else. I can trace the time of the takeover of world communications. I can do all of that, and then I can say, well, yes, tables used to be rock solid, but not rock solid anymore because I have rock solid information about this scenario, and this scenario undermines what I used to believe about tables. So I'm not stuck. But I start from where I am. I start from where I am. And it is perfectly appropriate to start from where I am. Now, there's an implication about this when you're talking to other people. I think your practice is usually pretty clear, but sometimes it goes off the rails. If I'm talking to somebody and I want to convince them that I'm right, where do I start from? I've got to start from things that he's committed to. Suppose I say to you, I'm trying to establish B, and I say, look, A implies B. And he responds, oh, but I think A is wrong also. So did I make progress? Not really. I've got to start with something that he's already committed to and then show him that an implication of what he's committed to is the thing that I'm supporting. That could give him reason to rethink what his position is. All communication, all persuasion, all instruction requires starting where the other person is and trying to move him on the basis of what he already accepts or the categories of things that he's trained to think of as solid and provide him with some of those, like sense experiences or new arguments. And in that way, try to move him. Because if you don't do that, not only can't you move him, but there's no reason for him to move. It's not as if he's stuck or psychologically handicapped. There's no reason for him to move unless you show him that in terms of what he's committed to, a move is required. That's reasonable. It's a reasonable position because, frankly, we have no other alternative. We have no better way to operate, no better way to function. That's what Harmon wrote about when he wrote about reasoning. That's why he called his book Change of View. When is it appropriate to change your mind about something? How do you establish that it's appropriate? How do you deal with other people whose minds you want to change? All these things have to be taken into account. And in particular, it's perfectly appropriate to take these positions and not be frightened by the fact, on the one hand, that you don't have an argument in favor, nor that somebody has a philosophical argument against. That shouldn't frighten you. Here's an example of arguments that people use. I'm just reading a book now, which came out a few years ago, called Blind Spot, by two authors. One was a professor at Harvard, and one is a professor at the University of Washington. They're psychologists. And they're reporting on very interesting psychological work that's been done. But along the way, they give expression to their political views and some of the philosophical views, is kind of offhandish. And if you're taken in by their credentials and their expertise in psychology, you could be unduly influenced by what they say. And here's one of the things they say, which is a popular argument among undergraduates. I would have thought they would know better. They're saying that, they're talking about group identity and how it's established, and sometimes how group identities can be established on very flimsy reasons. In particular, for example, religion. A religious group identity is very superficial, very flimsy, without any real substance. And one of the reasons they give is reflect a person, the same person, if we were born in Israel, would probably be attached to the Jewish tradition. If we were born in Poland, would probably be attached to Christian tradition. Born in Saudi Arabia, probably attached to the Muslim tradition. Born in India, probably be attached to the Hindu tradition. So there's nothing to it. It's just happenstance, accident. Just, flimsy or worthless. That argument has no value whatsoever. I could say to this professor at Harvard, and if you were born in rural Ukraine, would you have been a professor at Harvard? No. Would you have believed the result of research that you see now? No. So then you're being a professor at Harvard. It's flimsy. It's on the merest of happenstance. Has no substance whatsoever. That's no argument at all. There's no argument at all. Indeed, let's take a committed feminist and say to her, if you were born in Saudi Arabia, you wouldn't have been a feminist. So being a feminist is flimsy. It's happenstance. No principle behind it, no substance to it, because if you had been born someplace else, you wouldn't have been committed to it. That's nonsense. That's nonsense. The fact that I would have been, if I had been born someplace else, I would have turned out differently culturally, says nothing at all about the appropriateness or inappropriateness of the things that I believe. It just leaves it an open question. If all of us had been born 2,000 years ago, in almost everywhere in the world, we would have believed the earth is stationary. Does that mean our contemporary belief that the earth is in motion is flimsy, accidental, without substance, just an accident? Surely not. Surely not. And any, philosophers know this. I'm not telling you anything that's controversial. And here are two people who write a book. One's a professor at Harvard. One's they ought to know better. They ought to know better. Now, it's even worse than that. It's even worse than that. This I have one point now, which will take me 10 minutes, and I think we'll quit. There was a trick concocted in the 20th century. It goes back to the ancient Greeks, but in the 20th century they made it into a whole method, and it had very fruitful results. So I'll take you through step by step. This statement that I am making at this moment is false. Okay? What do you think? Is what I said true or false? Oh boy, we're going to be in trouble. Let's see. If you say it's true, but what it said was that what I was saying is false. So if it's true, then it's got to be false, which isn't a good outcome. Okay, say it's false. I say what I'm saying is false. And we're going to now say that that's incorrect, a mistake. So then, what I was saying must be true. So it can't be false like we just judged. So if you say it's true or false, you're in trouble. The Greeks discovered that. The Greeks were very clever. That's called the liar paradox. And it is a paradox. There's a lot of philosophy and everything else. But the trick is to take a proposition and apply it to itself and see what you get. In this case, you get a disaster. You get a paradox. Not always will you get a disaster. But you get very interesting results when you take a proposition and apply it to itself. Here's another one where you do get a disaster. All rules have exceptions. All rules have exceptions. Nothing's perfect. Everything breaks down somewhere. Nothing's complete. Nothing's really universal. All rules have exceptions. When you hear it like that, it sounds pretty reasonable. Okay, try applying it to itself. All rules have exceptions, including that one. I mean, isn't that a rule? Sure, it's a rule. So now, all rules have exceptions, including that one. Well, if it's including that one, what would an exception be to the rule that all rules have exceptions? An exception would be a rule with no exceptions. And the statement that all rules have exceptions tells you that there are rules without exceptions, which is not a good position to be in because it's refuting itself. So this is a trick that people have used. Take a proposition which seems to be universal and then apply it to itself. There is no such thing as truth. No such thing as absolute truth, real truth, objective truth. Everything's relative, right? Okay, everything is relative. Everything's relative. We want to ask, including that? Including those two words? That's also relative? Now here you don't get a paradox, but you get a crippling result. What are you going to say? Golly, I said everything's relative, so I guess even that has to be relative. Okay, that's not a contradiction, but look, suppose George in the corner there says there are things that are absolute. Are you disagreeing with him? If everything's relative, then being relative is also relative. So when he says that there are things that are absolute, that's appropriate. Because that's what's correct relative to him. So you're not disagreeing with him. When you say everything's relative, you're not criticizing anybody else's view. You have to be open to everybody else's view. If somebody else says, no, there are things that are absolute, you have to say, right. Is that what you were trying to do when you said everything was relative? I don't think so. When you said everything is relative, you want to convict the absolutist of being some kind of imperialist, some kind of prejudiced person back in the Middle Ages. You want to put him down as somehow inferior. But if your relativism is relative, then you can't say anything to a person who's an absolutist. I think that's not the way people intend it. What's the alternative? The alternative is saying, no. Let's not be so hasty. Everything's relative, except that. That's solid. That's stuck. That's chiseled in stone. But then the critic is going to say, why? What reason could you possibly have for accepting that everything else has limits, everything else has failures, everything else has counterexamples, except this? If your thought is people are limited and they have limited experience, and who knows what people will think of tomorrow, and we have limits of imagination. If that's your thought, how can you say that infects everything else and not this? Why doesn't it apply to this as well? You've taken an arbitrary position that has no reason behind it. So everything's relative when you apply it to itself becomes defeated in practical terms. Doesn't generate a paradox, but it becomes defeated in practical terms. You can't use it the way you want to use it. As I say, this is a very fruitful technique, applying a thing to itself. Now let's try for the born elsewhere, elsewhen type of argument. The argument goes like this. You're committed to Q. Poor you. You're committed to Q. You're so naive. Listen, if you had been born someplace else or sometime else, you wouldn't have believed in Q, would you? So I reflect, thinking of some other times and places, and I think, that's right. If I had been born then and there, I wouldn't have been committed to Q. So, the critic says, your believing Q now is just a feature of where you happen to be. Had you been someplace else, you wouldn't have had Q. Therefore, there's nothing behind it, no substance to it, no reason to accept it. It's just accidental. That's what he says. Let's accept what he's saying on provision. What he's telling me is, you're committed to Q. Elsewhere, elsewhen, you wouldn't be committed to Q, so give up Q. That's what he's saying. Let's call that the elsewhere, elsewhen move. The elsewhere, elsewhen attack. Somebody's committed to Q, you say to him, elsewhere, elsewhen, you wouldn't have been committed, so give it up now. That's the elsewhere, elsewhen attack. Okay, you're using that. Now I ask you, if you had been born in India 1,000 years ago, would you have used the elsewhere, elsewhen attack? Would you have believed in the elsewhere, elsewhen attack? Would you have thought it to be a reasonable attack? Surely not. Then by your own principle, you ought to give it up. The principle is, if I had been elsewhere, I wouldn't have believed it. So give it up. Well, then the whole technique of the elsewhere, attack, since had you lived elsewhere, you wouldn't have believed in that whole technique, then give up the technique. The technique is self-defeating. If I believe it, I can't have adequate reason to believe it. That's another failure with this technique. As I say, to have two respectable professors using it blithely, as if it were obviously correct, like as a philosopher, you know, whether to laugh or cry. At any rate, it's this kind of attack. When you hear this kind of attack, the right response is to say, are you kidding? I should give up what I believe because if I had lived elsewhere. Now, maybe I don't realize quite yet what's wrong with that attack, but it's just ridiculous. Because there were people who thought that you could levitate, so I should give up my belief that levitation is a mistake. Because there are people who thought the earth was flat, so I should give up my belief that the earth is round. I don't know how to answer your argument, let's say. I don't know what's wrong with your argument. But the conclusion is outrageous. Then don't be smothered. Don't be trapped. You say, I hear your argument, but I measure the strength of the argument against the strength of my opposition to the conclusion. I'm much more certain that the conclusion is wrong than I am of the cogency of your argument. And at least in the meantime, I'm going to reject the cogency of your argument. And there's nothing wrong with doing that. There's nothing logically wrong with doing that. That's called keeping your philosophical balance. Okay?